Welcome to Generations, a show which helps people 50 and better lead happy, healthy, and productive lives. Here's your moderator for today's episode, Jeffrey DeZellar.
Hello, and welcome to Generations. I'll be your moderator today. My name is Jeff DeZellar. Joining me are my co-hosts, Midge Bubany. Great to see you, Midge.
Great to be here, Jeff.
And Midge has a recent accomplishment to share with us. A short story of hers was published. Midge, could you briefly tell us about that?
My short story, You Took a Fine Time to Kill Me, Lucille, was accepted into the Twin Cities Sisters of Crime anthology called The Dark Side of the Loon. And all the stories had to be centered around a historic event in Minnesota. I picked the Halloween blizzard of '91.
Wonderful. Well, we're very excited for you, Midge. That's
excited.
terrific.
I can't wait to read it.
Absolutely. And Nadia Giordana. Nadia, great to see you as always.
It's good to be back again.
And I'm surrounded by authors and artists. Nadia also has a recent accomplishment or effort that she's undertaken that she could maybe talk about for a second.
I have a new project. It's called Wink, Writers in the Know. It's a magazine. It is for both men and women, writers, poets, and artists. And I gather creative material from all around the country. This is the first issue we're looking at here, but I'm already working on issue 2. And it's going to be a fun endeavor. It will keep me very busy.
Very exciting, very exciting. And Ed Noreen, actor, artist. Great to see you, Ed.
I'm doing a show.
Do tell.
I am doing a show in the Fringe Festival, Antonio and the Juice Men, which is a story set in Stillwater Prison with the Jesse James, who's played by a 15-year-old girl, and the Cole and Bob Younger, and we're performing Merchant in Venice, Shakespeare. And I play Shylock, which leads into a lot of our discussion today, the prejudice in the 1500s, Shakespeare's era. So it's great. We got play of the top 10.
I'll bet you that would be fun too.
Surrounded by superstars. And last but certainly not least, our guest today is Mordecai Specter. Mordecai, who I've known and Mike has known for over 50 years, I think. Great to see you again after all these years. Mordecai is the owner, editor, and publisher of American Jewish World magazine. You can see here. And I guess we'd just like to start, Mordecai, with how you got into this and sort of what you do and a little bit about the magazine.
Well, thanks for inviting me onto the show. And the Jewish World is the newspaper of the Jewish community in Minnesota. And we date it from 1912. So that was a paper called the Jewish Weekly, started by a rabbi from Lithuania, Samuel Deinard, who was kind of a visionary. He thought of journalism or a newspaper as a way of bringing the community together, the different streams of immigrants from different countries and people in St. Paul and Minneapolis and other places in Minnesota. And unfortunately, the Jewish Weekly failed, and they tried some other publications. And then in 1915, he teamed up with a guy named Frisch, Leo Frisch, and they published the first issue of the American Jewish World, 1915. So it's continuously published since then.
That's a long history.
Yeah, I think it's the oldest continuously published community newspaper in Minnesota.
Wow.
If you know of another one that's longer, you can let me know. But yeah, it's quite a history. And it always was a weekly, and then the economy kind of fell off a cliff in 2008, and in 2009 we went to bi-weekly publication. So every other week we have a print edition, and we put some of our content on a website. It's ajwnews.com, AJW like American Jewish World. So we have this big name, American Jewish World, but we're really Minnesota. We're the newspaper for the Jews in Minnesota. And we're on Facebook, American Jewish World on Facebook, and Twitter, MN Jewish World. And I think that's about it for
So you've got the
social
social media
Yeah.
and the online exposure in addition to the standard website.
Right. And we should do some kind of an app, a mobile app. I guess that would be the next step, since kids don't read newspapers. So sometimes I talk about the triple whammy facing the business. I'm a businessman. I stumbled into this newspaper ownership thing
How
about
did
10
that
years
come
ago.
about?
Well, I was working for this publisher, an elderly rabbi who lived in Florida. He was a pulpit rabbi in the Twin Cities, and then he left and lived in Boca Raton, Florida, which helped us get along, me being here and him being in Florida. And he wrote a column, continued to write a column for the newspaper well into his 80s, maybe 90s. And so at some point I thought we should have local ownership. The newspaper was kind of stagnating under this absentee landlord situation. So I'd never done anything like this before in my life, but I got a group of investors and we bought the assets of what was called AJW Publishing. So we started a company called Minnesota Jewish Media, and that's the parent company of the Jewish World newspaper. And that was in 2006, so 11 years now. I went from being the managing editor to being the editor and publisher of the newspaper. And I like the newspaper business. You meet a lot of interesting people, and there are a lot of great perks. And I've traveled to Israel 7 times since coming to the newspaper.
Were there any big challenges in making that transition and that acquisition?
I remember one of my partners telling me not to lose money. And that seemed okay at first, and then again, the economy kind of fell off a cliff, and it's hard to run a small business. We're a pretty lean organization. There's just a couple more or less full-time employees, and then freelance writers, but the business part of it is a challenge. I wear a lot of different hats, sell all the advertising for the newspaper, and then all the administrative tasks, and then I write and do some editing.
So the online presence is probably, fast forward 10, 20 years down the road, that will be the primary way that you get your content out to people. Is that a fair assumption, or do you think the newspaper is always going to be there?
People like the newspaper, and they kind of vote with their checks. They renew their subscription. Every day there's checks coming in renewing their subscriptions, and that's kind of how people express their confidence and support in the newspaper.
Right.
And the revenue for the paper is mainly print advertising. So, I mean, there are expenses with print, printing and mailing the newspaper, but also that brings in most of the revenue, the advertising and then subscriptions.
You said that you had met a lot of interesting people. Could you tell us about 1 or 2 notable people that you've met that really stuck with you?
Well, when we took over the newspaper in 2006, we kind of announced that a focus will be arts and culture. We wanted to be a catalyst for Jewish arts and culture in Minnesota. So I like doing the art stories, like I like jazz music. So I'm the editor, so the content kind of reflects my interests. There's maybe more about Middle East affairs than people want to read, and then more about jazz musicians. In the current issue of the paper, I did an interview with Ben Sidran, who's a jazz pianist and music scholar based in Madison, Wisconsin. And he's coming to play with his quartet at the Dakota Jazz Club. And Ed, you mentioned Elie Wiesel. I went to, actually it was a press conference that only one other person showed up for before his talk at Northrop Auditorium some years ago. So we had kind of a chat, we had conversation, and all kinds of musicians and artists and authors. In the old days when publishers had budgets, there was a parade of authors coming through our newspaper office, and we don't have that so much anymore. People like Harold Kushner, the guy who wrote When Bad Things Happen to Good People. Rabbi Kushner, remember him coming by, and Morris Dees, and the, what's his group, the Southern Poverty Law Center.
So this is more like when you had a budget to pay authors for their contribution to the newspaper, or some other
No,
reason?
this was more when publishers had a budget to promote their authors. Then,
Oh, okay.
there actually was a business for escorts to take visiting authors around to newspapers and TV stations, and that's kind of gone away.
Sound familiar, Midge?
No.
So the economic landscape has changed a little bit. But still, just generally, you get a front row seat to a lot of events, whether it's visiting speakers. There's a synagogue that has a kind of this high-powered speakers series. So they bring in Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton. This Bethel Synagogue in St. Louis Park. I didn't interview them, but I was invited to attend the speeches. They had Ehud Barak, the former Israeli prime minister, and in September, Michelle Obama is speaking. So, I don't know, I've met a lot of visiting diplomats from Israel and other countries, and authors, musicians.
How do you balance because I was looking at the website, very interesting reading, by the way, and
Thanks.
I'm not well informed on the issues, but I became a little better informed. But how do you balance, you mentioned the arts and music and so forth, but there's also some quite a bit of political content in there as well. How do you try and balance that within the paper, within an issue, or do you hear from your readers kind of, I'm sure you do, whether they don't like this or they do like that, or how do you strike that balance, Mordecai?
Some of them don't like me. Well, the editorials sometimes are kind of left-wing, which riles up a certain segment of the community. Although Jews are, as a minority, they're pretty liberal. They vote like 75% for the Democrats, and generally, I think we're in tune with the community. But I try to get, as far as the op-ed pages, try to get a mix of op-eds. Kind of skews to the liberal viewpoint, I guess. And then we're kind of the bulletin board for the community. So the paper always has a lot of local events. The Jewish community is highly over-organized, lots of groups. So we have to be mindful of what all the organizations and synagogues are doing and try to publicize their events as best we can. And then we have a news service out of New York. It's called JTA, which used to stand for Jewish Telegraphic Agency, which gives you an idea of how long they've been around. But they provide us with a lot of national and international news. And then the pot is always boiling in the Middle East. There's always something popping off there. So a lot of times the story on the top of page one is about Israel, or this week the Iran deal and Trump's inclination to get rid of the Iran nuclear deal. And then Trump. There's always Trump since, what, he's been in power for office for the last couple of years now, something like that.
Well, 200 days, I remember, that he's been there, so,
That's all.
yeah.
Okay,
It just seems like 2 years.
yeah.
It's like a
And
circus.
you have something to do with, in your paper, legal notices. Is that direct from the community too? People post legal notices? That's part of, I saw that on your website, that's why
Yeah,
I'm asking.
that's through the Secretary of State.
Okay.
We're a legal newspaper, so it's mostly, it's kind of a little revenue stream. We became a legal newspaper, and we can publish certificates of assumed name when someone starts a business. So it's something we do. We could do more of it.
It's not exactly exciting news.
No, that's pretty mundane. We have a few classifieds. The classifieds have kind of dwindled. Things have drifted over to the web, the international web system. And that's really kind of decimated the daily newspapers, big city newspapers. Star Tribune went through bankruptcy, and I think I mentioned earlier this triple whammy. What the challenges like decreasing identification with Judaism and the Jewish community. We're a Jewish newspaper. And then I mentioned that kids don't read newspapers. My sons are 20-somethings, 30. They don't read newspapers. They'll read something in the Jewish world if I put it right in front of them, so like they can't see anything else but the newspaper. And then kind of the lingering effects of the economic recession. We're a small business, and we're trying to make our way through this difficult economy.
I suppose it does make a difference. I don't know, and of course, I'm of the generation that having the newspaper, the book, the magazine, and having it in hand
Right.
there's just something about it. And with books, it's the
No.
smell of the ink in
Right.
the print. What is that? I don't know what it is. You can't get that online, but I have begun to read some things online, but not newspapers.
We were discussing earlier, as a democracy, you need an educated population that is aware of what is going on and has the ability to critically think. This latest election, it's been said, was decided on Facebook. We may be in one of the biggest crises in our history if we have a young population that does not read.
And they
And
get their
does
news
not-
from Facebook.
Yes, and they do not think critically.
Which brings up the fake news whole thing.
Yes.
You know, it's like, and it is difficult when you're reading articles on Facebook to tell whether it is true or made up. So that's a whole,
Takes a lot of
That's
effort to
it
try to
does.
sort that out.
We try to stick to the facts and
You're so out of date.
maintain journalistic standards, high-level journalistic
do you,
truth and accountability.
how do you check your sources, for example? Have you had any incidences where you weren't sure whether something was, or do you just go to the sources you know that are reliable?
Well, we use this JTA news service, and they've been good for the last 20 years that I've been at the newspaper, 22 years, and generally accurate reporting. And I've done a lot of reporting. I've never been sued for libel. I've been threatened a few times, but those have been efforts to intimidate me. Sometimes you hit a nerve. And we want to be provocative as far as opinion pieces, and people need some reason to open the newspaper. If it's just kind of bland content, people are going to drift away. So in some ways, if I write something that is controversial, that's good in the sense that people look at the newspaper again to see what kind of crazy things Specter wrote in the paper this week.
Do you have people that answer those? Do you have a readers section,
Yeah,
letters to the
lo-
editor?
longer rejoinders, we have a readers respond, kind of a brand for the op-ed pages, and then letters to the editor, like all newspapers. We get occasional letters.
You know, this is a great segue into the next portion of our show. And if we could all join together, basically, we wanted to talk for a moment about a general discussion question that has to do with what role the truth plays in the art of persuasion, which Mordecai, I think, is kind of your business, but I think we all could contribute to that. So what are anybody's thoughts? Who wants to light this candle and tell us what they think, what role truth does play in the art of persuasion? Any thoughts, Mordecai? Or?
I think truth is very important no matter what you're trying to persuade, no matter what you're trying to do with news. I think in the end, if you're being truthful and factual, you're going to get a lot more respect from your readers and the public.
Yeah, but I am truly worried about the amount of untruth that is being able to persuade our population, which I think is just, I just think it's so worrisome. It's that people hear what they want to hear, believe what they want to believe, and especially about who they're against and who they're for. If somebody says something bad about the cause or the people that they align with, they don't believe things that are bad, but they'll believe everything, no matter what the source is about somebody that they don't align with.
If they don't align with it, yeah.
Well, you know, Hitler learned through American advertising the big lie. You repeat something over and over and over and over, and people will start to believe it. And so this is really the biggest challenge right now that we're facing. And you brought up an interesting point. We used to have NBC, CBS, ABC. We used to have news channels that the conservatives attacked the channels for being liberal, but basically they were in the middle. Now people have a tendency to go to a channel or a news source that they agree with, which is conservative or liberal. So they're not getting the middle. They're not getting a balance. And they're being told what they want to hear. And they're reinforcing prejudices, guilt, which is part of the human condition. And it's something we've been battling since the beginning of time. And we're seeing it right now.
Yeah.
At the newspaper, I get all kinds of information and opinion stuff from across the spectrum, left, right, center. So I've gotten pretty good at recognizing rhetorical cant when someone is, shading an argument one way or the other. The unusual thing, I've been politically active for a long time, since I was a young teenager, and even before that, I've always been fascinated by politics. And I don't want to harp on this, but I've never seen a situation like what we have in national politics now. With the newspaper, we hew to the facts, and but it's a difficult atmosphere when it's so full of lies, and apart from the partisan deadlock, we really have a lot of work to do.
There used to be checks and balances, and I don't know what there's going to be in the coming decade to moderate news and news sources so that we can at least determine this is one I want to listen to because it does adhere to the facts. This is one that skews the facts. Who do we turn to find out about those things anymore?
We need more cartoons. Where's Will Rogers when we really need him?
Will Rogers
Cat
might
dog.
be the guy.
I think that free press is important. So we really have to stand up for press freedom. It's an important part of our
One thing,
democracy.
when I thought about this, the role the truth plays in the art of persuasion, in the short term, it doesn't seem to be that much. Here we're talking about fake news and hyperbole and, lying and misstatements and this and that. But I think in the long run,
Yes.
the long run, generally the truth will out. And we will find out, like what's going on now. Years down the road, we'll find out what it really is. But it's hard to sort through as history. The newspapers are the first draft of history, I guess. But depends on which newspaper you look at. But eventually, I do believe from my reading and my experience that ultimately the truth usually will out. Now, we may all be gone by the time that happens, but I think in the long term, the truth will win, but in the short term, as Mordecai says, it's not a pretty landscape.
No. Yeah, we have a lot of work to do, and
Yeah, but on a positive side. One is, I think, 3 million more people voted for Hillary. I think what it's done is unify people into their values, that oftentimes good comes out of bad. As we were also talking, all the millions of people that were killed in World War II, and particularly the Jews, rose a nation. And so a lot of times, Deepak Chopra, is that you don't argue with nature. Things happen, and a lot of times the bad and the good are mixed together.
And that's all we have for today. I'd like to thank our guest, Mordecai Specter. Excellent job. Keep up the good work on the newspaper.
thanks, Jeff.
And good to see you again. And to my co-hosts, we'll see you all next time.